Helen Joyce, a journalist and author of Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, also director of advocacy at the human rights charity Sex Matters. Helen Joyce, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on. First of all, briefly, what's your reaction to yesterday's ruling in the Supreme Court?
Relief, joy, vindication. This is what always should have been understood to be the law. Ever since the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, which stopped people from, for example, paying women less than men for the same job, we've known what sex is and we've known why women are discriminated against. We're discriminated against because of biological reality, not because of who we say we are and not because of pieces of paper. And then that excellent summary of the law since then, the Gender Recognition Act put a spanner in the works of it when the Sex Discrimination Act got rolled into the Equality Act in 2010. And ever since then, we've had this increasing and somewhat really bizarre and head-scratching question of what does it mean in equality and anti-discrimination law to commit sex discrimination? Does it mean that you're discriminating against people with one set of certificates, or does it mean you're discriminating against people with one of the two types of body? And the Supreme Court yesterday, in a very tightly argued statutory interpretation ruling, gave a unanimous judgment that it really is about bodies, that in our equality and anti-discrimination law, what we're talking about when we say sex, male and female, is the reality, the biological reality. I couldn't be more delighted.
Some people clearly aren't delighted by this, and the Supreme Court judges, as Ellie made in her point there, wanted to make it very clear that this isn't about a victory for any particular position on this, simply clarification of where the law stands on these matters. Some people will be really upset to hear this. Do they have any legal redress now? Could there be appeals to the European Court of Human Rights, or will it be a case-by-case basis? And could we find ourselves now going through even more legal battles as people test this through the courts?
No, I think what's going to happen is that a bunch of legal battles that are already underway will actually be withdrawn. So just to say, there was a victory on one side. There was a resounding victory for one of the two arguments that was put forward. For Women Scotland, a campaign group brought the Scottish Government to court. For Women Scotland won in every respect, and the Scottish Government lost in every respect, and that was unanimous from the court. So that's not what the Supreme Court was saying. What it was saying is that trans people have not lost rights because of this, and that is correct. In the Equality Act, there's a different protected characteristic, which is gender reassignment, that protected trans people from being discriminated against before this judgment, and it still protects them now. What has happened is that we have kept the protected characteristics of sex and gender reassignment separate, and that was right. So there are people who are upset. You're quite right about that, and it's a real shame because those people had been misled all along about the law by lobby groups on their side, which told men who identify as women that they have the right to come into women's spaces. They never had that right, because we can't have women-only spaces if men are allowed into them. That's just logic. And so they should never have been told that. But I understand that they were, and I understand they're feeling aggrieved today, because now they've been told that was wrong and they can't do it. You know, we have to find ways to accommodate people who aren't happy being the sex that they are. But we have to start with the huge majority of people. All of us have a sex. All of us need single sex spaces sometimes. Women in particular do. We cannot wreck our entire system of equality and anti-discrimination law. We cannot throw out women's rights just because there's a tiny number of people who don't like being the sex that they are. We start by what the majority, the huge majority, need, and then we think of little accommodations for the tiny minority.
Some would say others will be emboldened by this ruling. It could lead to confrontation. How would you respond to that?
No, it was the previous situation that led to confrontation. When people go into spaces that they're not meant to be, they cause confrontation. We have a bunch of legal cases underway at the moment in hospitals, in police searching, in other situations like that, where men have been told that if they identify as women, they have the right to force women to treat them as women. That caused confrontation. And now those men are not going to be told that they have the right to be treated as women. The confrontation can end.
But surely, if you are biologically a man or male, but feel that your gender identity is female, that in itself, if someone is telling you, and I get that there's been a clarification on the law yesterday on this, your feelings won't change, will they?
I mean, people have all sorts of feelings, but we can't accommodate feelings as if they override material reality. I mean, I really do understand that there are people who don't like being the sex that they are, but the fact is they are the sex that they are, and that matters to other people. You know, I want to do what I can to accommodate those feelings, sure, but I can't treat them like they're like reality. I repeat, if you allow a man into a women-only space, it ceases to be a women-only space. That man may very, very much want to come in, but we can't accommodate everybody. We have to think about what the huge majority of people need, and women need single-sex spaces. And men who don't like to be in the men's spaces, well, frankly, that's not a problem for women. But we can think about how to accommodate them, for example, with a third option.
What does this mean then, Helen, in terms of the practicalities of it? You know, but what might the implications be, for example, for a hospital of yesterday's ruling?
What the implication is that every single organisation in this country that has any policy that has anything to do with male, female, man, woman has to look at it urgently and check that in that policy, when it says male, female, man or woman, it means biological sex and not anything else. Because what the Supreme Court has said is there's no basis for any policy that means anything else, whether that's gender recognition certificates or whether that's self-ID. Any policy that says you go into whichever toilet suits you, or we will put men who identify as women, they may use different words, but that's the facts of it. Men who identify as women can go into the single-sex women's wards. All those policies are now clearly unlawful. And if they're challenged in court, whoever sets those policies can expect to lose and have to pay damages. So I say to every organisation in the country, every business, every regulator, every government department, they need to look through their policies urgently. They need to put this on their risk register, do it straight away, withdraw those policies and replace them with policies that are in line with this judgment, which is anywhere you say male, female, MF, man, woman, whatever your words are, your little pictograms, when it says the one for women, only women can go in there. And if it says men, only men can go in there. And anyone who goes into the wrong space has to be told the policy is not that and they've got to get back out. So gym changing rooms, hospitals, workplace toilets, all these places, they always should have been understood as what they were meant to be, single sex. You don't have the right to go into spaces that aren't for you.
Could there potentially be cases where people might argue that that in itself is transphobic and discriminatory, or does yesterday's judgment mean that doesn't stack up anymore?
Yesterday's judgment means that any such case is, as near as possible, guaranteed to lose. It's this word discrimination. When we put up a sign that says women only or men only, we are committing discrimination. We are saying this space is only for women. That means it's discriminating against men. Or this space is only for men. That means it's discriminating against women. But it is lawful discrimination. It is expressly allowed in the Equality Act to have single-sex spaces because people, especially women, need them for their privacy, safety, dignity and human rights. So you're allowed to do that. So a man who identifies as a woman who complains about being discriminated against because he's not allowed into a women's space, the answer is yes, you are being discriminated against. It's because you're a man, and it's lawful discrimination because this space is only for women, because women need spaces that men can't come into. This case will get nowhere in court.
Transphobia is something we've heard a lot of recently. There may be those who would argue that this could lead to more of it. Should trans people be more concerned today than they were yesterday about the way some people might perceive them and their lives?
I really don't think so. I think that one of the things that has caused a huge problem in recent years is that people who identify as the opposite sex have done things that really harm other people's human rights, and they've done them because they've been told by the lobby groups that represent them that it's their right to do so. So, for example, we've seen men insisting that they're entitled to compete in women's sporting competitions. When people do that, it's so obviously unfair and so obviously wrong that it causes resentment. And we know from opinion polling that really very few people agree that men should be entitled to compete in women's sports if they identify as women. So that's actually what's caused resentment and anger. about trans demands. They're not trans rights, they're trans demands. And now that law is so clear and those demands can be knocked back for what they are, which is unreasonable, I actually think it'll take the heat out of the issue. It's the unreasonable demands that caused the anger.
Helen, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on to BBC Radio Stoke this morning. Helen Joyce, journalist, author of Trans When Ideology Meets Reality and Director of Advocacy at the human rights charity Sex Matters.